Well, I think we'll get started here. Good morning. I'm Carol Finn. I'm president of the American Geophysical Union, and on behalf of AGU and its 62,000 members, I'd like to welcome you to this second annual Science Policy Conference. AGU's mission is to promote discovery in earth and space sciences for the benefit of humanity. We are committed to the practice of relevant and timely scientific research and the communication of our results to the public and our nation's policy leaders. It is that mission that brings all of us here today. Throughout history, scientific research and discovery have brought us monumental achievements such as global positioning satellites, weather satellites, computer chips that drive all of our devices, human flight, abundant food, and others. These advances have served as the underpinnings for our economic growth, improvements in public health and safety, and enhancements to our quality of life. Today, the nation faces a myriad of serious challenges. At least 1/3 of the U.S. gross domestic product is weather and climate sensitive. 1/3. In 2012, weather and climate disasters cost the U.S. $110 billion, making it the second costliest year since record-keeping began in 1980. I live in Colorado. This year's wildfire outside Colorado Springs was the largest wildfire that claimed the largest number of homes, so it was Colorado's worst wildfire, and it beat the last record, which was last year 2 miles away from where the new fire was. So I'm sure all of us can sit and think about examples from their own community that have seen weather-related, climate-related disasters and see the cost of that to local communities. Natural hazards events such as hurricanes, snowstorms, tornadoes, floods, heat waves result in hundreds of deaths per year. Swelling coastal populations, increased use of marine resources, and greater stress on the ocean from climate change are leading to adverse health conditions. Scientific projections show ocean levels will continue to rise and alter our coasts over the course of this century alone. Floods, droughts, and warmer temperatures are making it more difficult for farmers to grow crops as well as provide habitats for animals and fish. And while new energy technologies have allowed the U.S. to transition from being an importer of natural gas to being an exporter, they also bring new challenges for safely managing and controlling onshore resources. Once again, I live in Colorado. We have local communities outlawing drilling, getting sued by the state, and the reason the local communities are outlawing fracking and energy development is they're putting drill rigs next to schools. So we have competition with energy development and housing developments. Water, which used to cost farmers a few $100s per unit, energy companies are willing to pay communities thousands of dollars. So we have a very big tension in my state alone for competition for resources and with energy development. And all of these challenges will require coordinated and sustainable solutions that are based on the best scientific research available. The benchmarks for the success are clear. Severe weather events such as hurricanes, tornadoes, and earthquakes threaten lives and businesses across the country. However, decades of scientific innovation allow us to provide forecasting and tracking technologies, increased warning times, standards for building design and construction, and safety procedures that can protect the lives and livelihoods of millions. And we know that each dollar spent on mitigation related to wind, flooding, and earthquakes saves society an average of $4. So a very good return on that dollar investment. Revolutionary changes in natural resource management, such as clean and abundant drinking water and new energy technologies, including wind and solar power, are rooted in scientific innovation. And scientific research has resulted in the development of companies such as Google, Cisco Systems, and a variety of small businesses. It has also resulted in the development of hundreds of licensed inventions that contribute billions of dollars to the U.S. economy and create hundreds of thousands of new jobs. As we search for ways to build a foundation for a sustainable future, these are just a few examples of the benefits scientific research can bring to the table. Unfortunately, despite the clear benefits of scientific research and development, federal investments in research have been steadily decreasing. U.S. funding for scientific research and development is at its lowest level in more than a decade, currently representing only 2% of the federal budget. This deficiency is being compounded by the impacts of sequestration, leaving great uncertainty about the U.S.'s ability to remain a leader in scientific innovation, a role that has contributed greatly to our economic growth and quality of life enjoyed by hundreds of millions of Americans. It is this dichotomy that motivated AGU to create this Science Policy Conference and to bring it here to you today. As scientists, AGU and its members know the value of our work and the impact it can have. However, if our research is conducted in a vacuum and the results and lessons learned are not shared broadly, then the societal benefits will be significantly limited. We have a responsibility to make sure that policymakers and the public understand the value of our science and have access to the best scientific knowledge available. Policy decisions that are informed by science will be much more effective in protecting our families, wisely utilizing our natural resources, and working to build a foundation for a healthy economy. That is why we have brought together this diverse group of experts from leading scientific research institutions, federal and state agencies, industry leaders, and NGOs. We recognize that creating a space for a solution-based dialogue amongst a broad spectrum of stakeholders in the scientific enterprise is necessary to build understanding, confidence, and respect across our professional divides. We also recognize that this must be an ongoing dialogue because science continues to advance and because the social and economic and political backdrop of the world in which we live continues to evolve. Improving the connection between science and policy will not be an easy task, but we believe that this conference can play an important role in our collective success. The program for the next 2 days is focused on topics that are already having real and tangible impacts on every community, city, state, and region across the country, not to mention every industry. From climate's impact on agriculture and human health to the water-energy nexus and the potential for carbon capture and storage, research in the areas that we will discuss over the next 2 days will be critical to our abilities to save lives, enhance national security, drive technological innovation, and stimulate economic development. By fostering better communication, AGU hopes to ensure that results and lessons learned from our research can benefit society to the maximum extent possible, both now and in the future. Before we move into our main program, I'd like to take a minute to thank our partners, without whom this important event would not have been possible. The 2013 Science Policy Conference partners are the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, and the Soil Science Society of America, the American Geosciences Institute, the American Institute of Physics, the American Meteorological Society, the Arctic Research Consortium of the U.S., NOAA, the Consortium for Ocean Leadership, and the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research. Thank you very much to our partners. I would also like to thank our sponsors for their generous support. They include Shell, Munich Re, Sandia National Labs, the IRIS Consortium, Lockheed Martin Space Systems Company, Nature Climate Change, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, Scripps Institute of Oceanography, and Swiss Re. I'd like everyone to give a hand to our partners and our sponsors. Thank you. These organizations share AGU's belief in the transformative power of science and our commitment to improving the intersection between science and public policy for the benefit of humanity. I sincerely thank them for their contributions. Now I'd like to introduce Christine McEntee, AGU's Executive Director, who will be serving as the moderator for this morning's plenary. Chris?
Thank you, Carol. Let me echo your thanks to our sponsors and our partner organizations. This important event would not be possible without their support and continued commitment to bridging the connection between science and policy. A couple of quick housekeeping notes, then I want to introduce this morning's plenary session and our speakers. Both this session's and tomorrow's plenary sessions on climate change are being live streamed. I want to offer a special welcome to all of you who have joined us online this morning for this plenary session. We will be taking questions also from our online audience as well as those from you here in the room, and I'm really looking forward to participating in this conversation and hearing your thoughts, your questions, and your comments. Now, all of us have one of these little things in our pocket. I don't want you to turn them off because they're going to be a valuable tool for you to be able to engage in the conversation with us on an ongoing basis, but I would ask that you silence them so that we don't have any interesting ringtones or other messages coming in while we're having our conversation here. This conference is really about starting a dialogue with our communities. Throughout the presentation this morning, tweet us your questions using the conference hashtag AGUSPC, which is up on the screen behind me. For the breakouts later today, we will have individual hashtags that will be available in each room. That way you can tweet questions to specific sessions and presenters, and this is also how our audience that are participating virtually will be able to provide questions to us. Also, as you can see on the screen behind me, we are conducting a live poll during this morning's talk. There are only 2 questions, so please take time to respond. We will be discussing the results later during the question and answer portion of this plenary. The link to participate on the screen is behind me. You'll see it says spc.agu.org/survey1. And also, you should have received an email this morning also with that link. When you press on the link, it should take you right to the survey. The survey is going to close at 10, so please make sure you get your responses in by then. I am so excited to be able to moderate this morning's plenary session on the value of science. In many ways, this topic is the essence of why AGU created the Science Policy Conference. As you heard Carol say a few minutes ago, informed management and policy decisions benefit from sound scientific research. And whether it's forecasting tornadoes in Oklahoma, or sparking innovation through spin-off technologies, investments in research and development are the underpinning of our society's well-being and growth. Unfortunately, the difficulties of our current fiscal situation are impeding science's ability to inform sound policy decision-making, protect public safety and national security, and provide opportunities for economic growth. The 2 top funders of basic scientific research are the federal government and academic institutions, with federal funding accounting for over half of all the funding of basic research in the United States. Years of decline of the federal investment in this vital research, coupled with the long-term impacts we will see from sequestration, have left us dangerously close to losing our position as the world's leader in innovation. The purpose of today's plenary is to showcase the value that science brings, to discuss ways we can overcome the hurdles facing us, and to outline areas for future growth. Now I would like to introduce our panelists. Dr. Cora Merritt is the acting director of the National Science Foundation. Since January 2009, she has served as senior advisor, acting deputy director, and now acting director. Previously, Dr. Merritt served as NSF's Assistant Director for Education and Human Resources, where she led the organization's mission to achieve excellence in STEM education. And from 1992 to 1996, she served as the first Assistant Director for the Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences Directorate, where her contributions earned her NSF's Distinguished Service Award. Our second panelist is Bart Gordon, who became a partner in K.L. Gates after 26 years representing the state of Tennessee in the United States House of Representatives. He served as chairman of the House Committee on Science and Technology from 2007 to 2010, and in 2007 he championed the American Competes Act, which was signed into law by President Bush. In 2010, he also engineered the passage of the America Competes Reauthorization Act, renewing federal commitments to research and development as well as education. Dr. Merritt's going to speak first, and then Mr. Gordon will speak, and then we'll open up for dialogue and conversation. Dr. Merritt? Please welcome Dr. Merritt to the stage.
Thank you very much. And it is indeed a great honor to help AGU kick off this extremely important conference. And I'm looking forward, I think, to your questions. I'm certainly looking forward to any feedback. The AGU is certainly one of our nation's most dynamic advocates for scientific research. So it's a pleasure to be here this morning and to engage with you in a discussion about the future of science. It's also a great pleasure for me to see former Congressman Bart Gordon again. As you already know, he was chair of the House Committee on Science and Technology. And during that time, I had the great fortune to be able to work with him and with the committee. I know he is a great believer in the importance of federal support for fundamental scientific research. And I look forward to exchanging some thoughts with him and with you during today's conference. Now, as we look at I'm really going to be focusing very heavily on the National Science Foundation. As is indicated here, the Science Foundation, for more than 6 decades actually, has had a profound impact on America's technological infrastructure by funding transformative research that has pushed forward the frontiers of scientific knowledge. When I refer to we, I have to admit that the work is done by you. The work is done by the communities. Our role is to help support that research. Currently, we are budgeted at about $7 billion a year. And of that amount, 94% is spent supporting research, education, and facilities. What this means is that most of the budget actually goes back to states, localities, and especially to higher education through the grants and awards that we make. We fund basic research across all fields of science and engineering disciplines, and in that sense, we're rather distinct among federal agencies that fund research. We also fund research and education having to do with science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. With reference to the academic sector, we provide 22% of the total federal support of basic research in all of the fields of science and engineering. And each year, we award thousands of grants that engage the talents of more than 300,000 researchers, postdoctoral fellows, trainees, teachers, and students. And collectively, as reported here, NSF-funded researchers have won more than 200 Nobel Prizes for their work in the fields of chemistry, economics, physics, physiology, and medicine. In fact, all of the scientific fields that the Nobel recognizes. We cannot take claim for those awards made in literature. I wish we could, but we are very proud of what we do in the other fields. The funding has a broad impact on U.S. industry, on the economy, and indeed on the society. And that's why the focus of this conference and AGU makes such a difference, because of your commitment to enhancing the impacts of the investments that are made. What we try to do is to enable the very best minds to realize dreams, to help keep the nation at the forefront of the world's science and engineering enterprise. I often think of the Langston Hughes poem, "What Happens to a Dream Deferred?" In this case, we're seeking to keep from having dreams deferred. With reference to the investments, we want to say a little bit about investing in the future through science and engineering. This is a crucial time, as already noted, a crucial time for scientific research. There are the discussions going on, but in addition, there are the accomplishments, and I want to say a bit about some of the accomplishments, some of the outcomes from the investments that the National Science Foundation has made. Now, I could make, I think, a pretty spirited argument for the continued funding of basic research. But rather than try to address these in words, I want to give you some examples of the breakthroughs that have rippled through the science and engineering community that have brought about great advances. You see one featured here, the Internet. This is one example of the NSF-supported research leading to a discovery that has transformed not only our nation, but other nations as well. Now, of course, NSF was not responsible alone for the development of the Internet. We would like to take full credit, but there were some others involved, many other players, including the Department of Defense and early collaborations among academic institutions. Nonetheless, NSF played a key role in shaping the early growth and operation of the Internet, helping it to grow from 2,000 connected computers in 1985 to 2 million in 1993. We created NSF-Net, which was the first large-scale use of Internet technologies among independent research networks. This was eventually decommissioned in 1995, and this ushered in the era of the privatized Internet. There are other examples. Revolutionary weather sensing research at the NSF-supported National Center for Atmospheric Research and at universities was instrumental in developing Doppler radar as a methodological tool for meteorology. Research into the Doppler effect has helped scientists and meteorologists see and detect near-ground wind shears, which in turn have enabled greater accuracy in forecasting the location and severity of weather. And as you know, Doppler radars have become extensively used in fundamental research on meteorological phenomena, from tornadoes to large storms. And today, Doppler radar enables meteorologists to forecast the location and severity of weather with greater accuracy, resulting in improved public safety and lives that are saved. Again, this isn't something I need to convince this audience about, but I do want to note the way in which fundamental research has led to such important developments with significant consequences for all of the society. The research vessel, Sikuliak. Last October, the National Science Foundation enabled the launching of the new Alaska Region Research Vessel, or Sikuliak. This was enabled by funds provided through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or the stimulus funding. Sikuliak, incidentally, will soon embark on its first scientific mission. It will enable the exploration of the Arctic to advance our understanding of climate change and the world in which we live. And over the next 3 decades, Sikuliak will provide far expanded exploration, not just of the Arctic, but of oceans and the environmental impact that changes in oceans have on the world's weather. With reference to oceans, again, as you're aware, with atmospheric carbon dioxide levels rising, the oceans are absorbing more carbon dioxide, lowering the pH of surface waters and leading to greater acidification. This interest in acidification is, again, one that is fundamental for the National Science Foundation. And we're supporting work then to understand, predict acidification and the long-term effects from marine chemistry and ecosystems, and also we're making the attempt to understand that this is a slow process. I mention this because in the interest of returns on investments, often there is a demand or an interest in having immediate returns. Some developments do not occur so immediately that you can identify those kinds of developments right away. There is also the Ocean Observatories Initiative, another important effort to enable fundamental research into the complex interactions of environmental forces within the oceans. So OOI will enable continuous interactive access to the oceans by way of multiple types of sensors, producing never-before-seen views of the ocean's depths. This is exciting not just for the research and knowledge that will be advanced, but consider what this will mean for STEM education and for the ability for students to understand a lot more about the worlds in which we live. Mentioned a while ago is the whole area of water and the quest for clean water, because it's been estimated that 1 in 6 people in the world lack access to adequate water. And more people die because of polluted or inadequate water supplies, actually, than from war. And even in the U.S., the long-term water supply is under threat. This is especially evident in certain parts of this country. In the future, clean water may well be the world's most valuable resource, or at least one of the most valuable resources. But with NSF funding, researchers, some of them represented here in this audience, some of you are responding to the matters of contamination produced by pesticides, heavy metals, saltwater intrusion. You're responding to this with the question of how can we understand better what would be inexpensive, rapid, and sensitive ways for detecting and removing the contaminants. What are the possibilities for technologies, for knowledge that has not yet unfolded? These are developments that, as we've said before, have profound implications for our larger society. Sustainable energy. Developing a sustainable energy supply is one of the great challenges facing this nation. And through many of our funding mechanisms, we've started to focus on clean biofuels, renewable energy sources, such as wind, solar energy, that, as you know, that's why they're called renewable, because they are replenished on a regular basis. Biofuels derived from plants, an important type of renewable fuel. Researchers are exploring ways to use algae, engineered bacteria, to produce gasoline. These green gasoline alternatives should provide products that are more compatible and more energy dense than some of the fuels currently being used, and would be far better for the environment. And again, this is a part of our whole effort to think about knowledge for sustainability. There are also the interesting issues, the threats that come from solar flares or plasma that erupts from the sun's surface. These have enormous potential for impact on the Earth's atmosphere and can cause widespread damage to communications infrastructure. Some of our colleagues from the Directorate for the Geosciences made a presentation to the National Science Board not long ago about space weather, about the knowledge that exists, about the things not yet known. And I can tell you, people left that room very concerned, more knowledgeable, but more fearful in a way of what the possibilities would be than had ever occurred to them. It was simply bringing to their attention what a number of people already knew about the potential effects, for example, on the electric grid and other phenomena. But this issue of the threats is exactly one of the things that our agenda is all concerned about. There is this matter of reconstructing ARDI. So since the beginning of modern science, researchers have been searching for evidence of the earliest human ancestors. One of the things that we have a curiosity about is where did we come from and what's been that whole process. So with the funding from NSF and other institutions, in 2009, an international team of scientists announced their thrilling discovery and reconstruction of a fairly complete female skeleton dating back to 4.4 million years ago. And in all, 47 scientists from 10 countries contributed to research on the skeleton find and the reconstruction of the geology and biology where ARDI had lived. Again, NSF was proud to have been one of the contributors to this whole work. To ARDI, as she's now called fondly, that ARDI, this ancient skeleton, is believed to represent a new kind of hominid from the family that includes humans and our ancestors. There are revolutionary implications for social structure that might be apparent in the anatomy of ARDI. So, for example, this 4.4 million year old hominid opens up a new chapter on human evolution because it is as close as we have come to finding the last common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans. Now, I'd like to wrap some things up with some comments about cross-agency initiatives for urgent needs. These are matters that have particular relevance, I hope, for AGU. For we're finding that more and more of the grand challenges that humanity faces, that more and more of those challenges require integrated responses across the full range of sciences. In other words, they cannot be solved within one disciplinary framework. One example of this, interdisciplinary work on hazards and disasters. This is a part of our larger activity on the science, or C's, Science, Engineering, and Education for Sustainability. But one part of this has the overarching goal to catalyze, to bring together well-integrated interdisciplinary research on hazards-related science and engineering, all designed to improve our understanding of natural hazards, human-made hazards linked to natural phenomena, not just to understand, but to mitigate the effects and better prepare for responses to disasters. Or stated another way, the goal is to prevent hazards from becoming disasters. This Hazard Seas, then, aims to make investments in strongly interdisciplinary research that will reduce the kinds of negative impacts that we know can exist. There is also, in the context of the Seas initiative, coastal seas. Here I need not remind you of the disastrous effects of last year's Superstorm Sandy. It showed that our coastal areas are extremely vulnerable to a variety of threats. And more than half of the world's human population lived in coastal areas in 2000, but this proportion is predicted to increase to 75% by 2025. That means that life in coastal areas really will have to be it could be very precarious, and the question becomes, how do we understand better what needs to be undertaken with reference to coastal areas? So it's a major challenge to understand the dynamics of coupled human-natural systems. For those, and I know there are not many in the audience, but for those who look for research opportunities, let me announce that we expect to make the first awards from the Coastal Seas program within the next few months. Now, having said we have a comprehensive commitment to empower discoveries, we play, we hope, a vital role in ensuring that America remains at the epicenter of the revolution in knowledge, the revolution that's taking place in research and discovery. Yet, we face challenges. We face challenges known to other research funding agencies. We face challenges that occur in a budgetary environment that, as already noted, is not as favorable as once had been anticipated. We meet today here at the AGU in what has to be a spirit of collaboration and open exchange of ideas. And I'm especially struck by the forum article in EOS that raises a number of questions. For it says, even as we're making the exciting discoveries, we're living with flat or even reduced budgets. One of the questions in that article that I raise with you as well is, how do we set priorities for the funding that we have, and how do we do this collectively? This cannot be done exclusively by the National Science Foundation or any other agency. It has to be in collaboration with communities, communities of researchers, communities of industrialists, communities of educators. How do we make those decisions? How can we collaborate better, the article asks, on larger projects so that we realize the research potential from the limited funding? How do we steer clear of political issues and political tussles that in the end do nothing to advance the prospects of science? And the article asks, going forward, how do we find the golden balance among the many forces that are competing for the limited funding we have available? It's no exaggeration, then, to say that the future of American scientific inquiry rests on our ability to answer these kinds of questions. I then look forward to the conversation, for what we want to do is ensure that the National Science Foundation remains, as our motto says, the place where science and discoveries begin. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning, everyone. As Christine said earlier, my name is Bart Gordon, and I'm particularly pleased to be here with Dr. Cora Merritt. As you just heard, she is a great advocate not only for the National Science Foundation, but for the scientific community at large, and so thank you for your good service. I was particularly piqued with the comment earlier that this, you're looking for, or the conversation today is the intersection of science and public policy for the benefit of humankind. That's a great way to start the morning. And I hope that this conversation will be expanded to a much larger community. But first, let me start with a personal comment. As I was coming in this morning, I noticed there was a little redheaded girl in the front door there. And I have a daughter, she's 12 years old, and she's redheaded. And so whenever I see a redheaded girl, I always think of my daughter. And so it was when she was starting, this was a kindergarten age girl, and I remember when Peyton was starting kindergarten, it was a new school, and so they were trying to get the kids to interact and get to know each other. And so they had to do skits together. And so one of the skits that my daughter and another little girl did was they had to pretend like they were talking to a talking bullfrog. And so that's, they were doing that. And so they had to convince this bullfrog, they had to kiss the bullfrog, and as he told him, if they would kiss him, then he could be a congressman again, and not a bullfrog any longer. He was put under a spell. And so he kept pleading, please, won't you just kiss me so I can be a congressman again? No luck. And so finally the other girl reached down and picked up the bullfrog, put it in her pocket, and walked off. And my daughter said, aren't you going to kiss him? And she said, no, talking bullfrog's worth a whole lot more than a congressman. And certainly more than a former congressman. But I'm still very glad to be here with you this morning. You know, when Christine mentioned that I was chairman of the Science Technology Committee. And shortly after being elected, a reporter asked me what was my area of science. And I thought a moment, and I said, political science. It really is trying to take the good ideas of folks like you and try to put it into public policy. And I enjoyed having that opportunity. And so what I want to do today is give you a little bit of a framework, I guess you might say, of some of the political science that's going on so that we can integrate that into the harder sciences. I don't know whether you had a chance, and I'm going to start just on sort of a broad theme. I don't know whether you read this this weekend, but in the Sunday New York Times, Richard Haass, who is the president of the Council of Foreign Affairs, had, I thought, a very interesting article. And it was entitled, "America Can Take a Breather, and It Should." And the first sentence was, "The U.S. is currently enjoying an unprecedented respite in the foreign policy arena." Now, you may think that's a little odd with Syria, North Korea, terrorism everywhere. But then he goes on to explain that in the last 3.5 centuries of modern international era, great powers have always had a rival that was trying to replace them, and leading to World War I, World War II, the Cold War. But we really don't have that now. America really is unprecedented in the world. Now you can say, well, what about China? China has a lot of problems, and really we're not, in many ways, we're not threatened there. And in another measure, it's hard to believe, but the United States spends more on our national defense than the next 10 countries combined. So in many ways, we really aren't challenged now. And so it really does give us an opportunity to take a break, try to rebuild things here at home, and really not to squander this respite. Now, he goes on to make some recommendations. They're the usual Thomas Friedman suggestions that I agree with, and we've seen, you know, over and over. But a lot of it, I think, it's a combination of economic strength is also international strength. And with that economic strength, it determines what you can spend on your military, on foreign assistance, and what you can spend on research to continue to have that strength of economy. It really means you're the big bear in the woods when you have that good economy. And I think one way to translate that is into a standard of living. So here is really where you might be saying, where's all this going to? Here's where you come in. There are approximately 7 billion people in the world. And of those 7 billion, about half of them that are working make less than $2 a day. So we're sort of at a fork in the road. What are we going to do? Are we going to continue to have this economic power by competing on wages? Well, if we do, then my daughter and your kids and grandkids are going to inherit a national standard of living less than their parents, reversal of the American dream, which means that we have to take the other path. And really, there's a formula. Vannevar Bush in 1945 sort of gave us this linear path. And it was that if we invest in education and in research, then we get innovation. That innovation then is given to the private sector that makes new jobs, makes new services and goods and jobs, which creates revenue, which then we invest in education and research, and it goes around and around and hopefully continues to grow. However, I think we're seeing in this dysfunctional world of government the difficulties that universities are having and our economic situation, that this partnership, really which was built on the government, universities, and industry, is not quite working the way it did in 1945 or those decades after that. Universities are pressed for funds. Tuitions keep going up. In terms in the industrial world, there are no Nobel labs. If you talk to any CEO, they'll tell you that if they can't get a return on their research in 2 or 3 years, they just feel like they can't make those investments. And then you're seeing, again, a government that is sort of rethinking its role in terms of investing in research. So let's talk about, if I can, again, you must wonder, what's this alternative universe that we're in here if they don't understand the importance of research? So let me try to give you a little background on what's going on, as I view it, in the world of politics. And let me also maybe give a preface here, and that is that I am a Democrat, but as chairman of the Science Technology Committee, all 151 bills and resolutions that we got out were all unanimous. And so I'm really not trying to make a political statement here. I think that things work better when we all work together. But a part of the problem that we have is a result of decades of redistricting, very partisan redistricting. And what you'll see now in the last election, there were only 16 Republicans that were elected in seats that President Obama carried, and only 9 Democrats elected in seats that Mitt Romney carried. So by and large, through this hyper redistricting, we have created highly Democratic seats and highly Republican seats over the years. So that now the primary, really, for all intents and purposes, is a general election for most people. And so, by definition, you really only have the extremes of both parties participating in those early primaries. So you have people coming to Washington, elected by folks who don't want them to compromise, who think there's only one way to do things. That's a bad way to get started. And then what you'll find is that there are still moderates in both parties, but I think the Tea Party effect really has been greater in not just electing so-called Tea Party people, but rather the threat of the primaries. Most Republicans now, moderate Republicans, they'll tell you they're afraid of being primaried. And so, with the Supreme Court case not too long ago of Citizens United that allows unlimited, anonymous money to come into elections, everybody's afraid of their primary. And so nobody wants to stray too far from that extreme base. And so you have really a situation that is, as I say, very polarizing. And now we take a look at science. And what this extremes really on the right is saying, used to there was a concern that the government was going to do something that was more politically motivated than the facts would indicate. And so those folks would say, well, let science make that determination. Now they think that science really is a plot, that it's a liberal plot. It's a way for the universities and the scientists up in ivory towers to establish policy for their own benefit. Climate change is a good example in that there are many folks who simply don't think that climate change is real or won't admit climate change is real because of these extremes of their party. And so they're viewing science as a way, again, this liberal plot to try to validate something that they don't think is really true. And so really the fundamental framework for managing science and technology, which has really changed very little since the 1940s, I think we're going to have to adapt to a new and a different world. Fortunately, there are folks that are thinking about this. Neil Lane and Norm Augustine have started to gather folks for a convening of this kind of conversation, and we're going to be convening again in September, which hopefully we can talk about this intersection of government, universities, and the private sector, how they intersect, how they have to intersect now with a new dynamic that will allow our country to make that kind of investments that, again, are going to let my daughter and your kids continue to inherit that national standard of living greater than their parents. But all of you have a role to play in this too, and I think it starts with this conversation. Dr. Merritt is a good role model for all of us. She was what we say was putting a face on science earlier and talking not just about science, but the real outcomes. I know several years ago, Doris Matsui, who is a wonderful lady, and she represents the Sacramento area of California. There was an NSF reauthorization coming up, and so we had an amendment that said that any scientist that received an NSF grant had to take a course in English. But what we meant was not the spoken English, but being able to communicate what you're doing to the public. And I think you have to help us with that, putting a face on it, communicating to the public what you're trying to accomplish, what the benefits of your work is, so that we then can carry that to a larger, a larger conversation. Quite frankly, we have to have that type of ammunition if we're going to go and fight the battles for the funding that's necessary in these very difficult times. So with that overview, then, Christine, I think we're going to take some questions, hopefully have a conversation and expand that, as I said, to a larger platform. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Merritt and Congressman, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. You certainly have painted a really interesting picture of all these wonderful discoveries of science from Dr. Merritt that I think most of the American public just takes for granted. They get to see their Doppler weather and they just assume that didn't come from anywhere, you know, but of course it took years of research to get to the point where we know to take shelter when there's a severe weather warning. And you've talked about a potential new paradigm given the political and funding environment that we're in. We're going to start with questions. For those of you who are participating online, please tweet your questions so we can make sure you can participate in the dialogue. And for those of you who are in the live audience here, if you could please come up to the microphone, one of these two microphones here, and when you're ready with your question, please also say your name and where you're from so that we can give our panelists a little bit of an idea of a more personal interaction than just an anonymous question. And while you're thinking about your questions, let me start off. Given that the American Competes Act is up for reauthorization, and given what we know about these discoveries that have come from NSF and other federal funding, but the new realities, what do you see as priorities in the reauthorization of that act as it's undergoing reauthorization?
Do no harm.
Do no harm. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, there has been a really changing dynamic. A real quick refresher. I guess it was 2005 when four of us asked the National Academies to do a report on competitiveness in America in the 21st century. The result of that was Rising Above the Gathering Storm. Mm-hmm. I then took most of those recommendations, all those that were within the jurisdiction of the Science Committee, and within 6 months of becoming chairman of the committee, we passed that bill overwhelmingly on a bipartisan basis, and President Bush signed it. One quick side note, I remember when we were in the Oval Office and President Bush said something to the effect, well, this is a pretty good bill, except for that ARPA-E thing. Fortunately, that ARPA-E thing is growing and doing well now. So then you go 3 years later, although we still had some bipartisan support. It was, unfortunately, the idea here in Washington is that whether you're Democrats or Republicans, the House or the Senate, if you're in the minority, the way you get the majority is you try to stop the majority from getting anything done. And so here we have, again, 3 years later, after we had overwhelmingly passed this bill, there was an effort to stop it from passing. I won't go into all of the really unusual in ways it was done, but we did not pass that bill until 4/31 of the last day of Congress. It really ruined my last year in Congress because we were working on this, tirelessly, and there was that kind of a change. And so I think we have to be very careful now that, again, that there can be some improvements, certainly, to the Competes Act, but again, do no harm. I would rather not reauthorize it than to reauthorize it and do damage to the National Science Foundation in terms of peer review or other areas that's being discussed. Dr. Merritt?
No, I agree. It's very interesting. because I think, if I go back to that earlier bill you were talking about, it was around some higher level principles. Those are the kinds of things that you'd really want. You're authorized to continue the kind of innovativeness. And you can't always anticipate what's going to be important for that innovation. The level, if it's highly specific, it constrains far too much. So this idea then of doing no harm and trying to anticipate that circumstances change, and how do we try to be prepared for those circumstances. So I'm intrigued by the Congressman's observation.
So just one follow-up. You know, Congressman, you mentioned gathering the rising storm, which really did serve as a catalyst in terms of this bill being put into place under your leadership. Do you think we need another kind of catalyst like that in terms of being able to do the no harm that you both are speaking about? I'd appreciate both of you giving comments on that.
Well, I think we do. The interesting thing about the Rising Above the Gathering Storm report, I remember very well when Norm Augustine came before the committee and made the report. I told him that he really didn't, other than ARPA-E, he really didn't tell us anything that we didn't know. But what he did is they put it in an actionable format, and I think that was very important. And so, yes, I do think that we need to, well, you might know there was that the Rising Above the Gathering Storm band got back together, and they had a review, and after maybe 5 years, the bottom line was things aren't getting any better. And so I think that there does need to be another report one of the things that made Rising Above the Gathering Storm important was that it was a bipartisan report. It had academic, stellar individuals. It had top folks from the national academies and from the business community. So it had wide support. And we need that same type of wide buy-in, I think, to review this intersection between, again, the government, universities, and industries, and how that can best be put on maybe a new course.
Dr. Merritt, would you like to comment on that? Or?
I certainly endorse the idea that the more the dialogue, the better. One of the things that Rising Above the Gathering Storm did was to suggest that there's a storm brewing, and it had a lot to do with what we needed to think about for preparing the future, preparing young people for the future. One of the issues that comes on the table now is trying to figure out what kinds of arguments, what kinds of ideas resonate best for what sorts of communities. So I've said a number of times, it's very hard to get a 10-year-old, get your daughter, excited about science if we say this is going to enhance the nation's competitiveness. I don't think she's sitting around saying, oh yeah, that's why I want to go into science. I got to be competitive. So you've got to think about how the different sorts of arguments come together that at base are very much concerned with what this conference is all about. We are concerned about science engineering for advancement of humanity. If you say that, that doesn't exactly get everybody all mobilized. So that's why I'm curious about how AGU translates the ideas that are at the base of what you stand for into the kinds of arguments that resonate well across the different communities that we do have to mobilize if we're indeed going to rise above the gathering storm.
And that's putting a face on it. And, you know, Dr. Merritt is one of the top scholars in the area of STEM fields. And as you know, there's some discussion now. I think there's something like 203 different STEM programs across the government. And so do all of those need to be combined into one and put in the Department of Education? Absolutely not. I think they're certainly not into the Department of Education. But I think there can be, you know, maybe there might be some overlap. But here is what it does. NASA has STEM education programs, so it allows kids to see what NASA does, whether it's the Department of Agriculture, you know, whether it is NSF, whether it's the national labs. That's how you get them engaged, by seeing how you take the books and information in the books and will translate it, you know, into the real world. And so I think that's, you know, an important. I think we also have to recognize that women and minorities are, you know, that's where our best bump we can get, is very much underrepresented, and we've got to go into those communities and explain to them, that there's a role for them and what they can do. The other, and then I'll try to not talk so much. Dr. Merritt, I think, hit a note that I think is important in this new time of austerity, and that is both interdisciplinary and what you might call a synergy. I think we have to look how we can get better use of our dollars and look cross-agency, and look how and you're going to solve a problem better that way too, by looking at it with a with a scientist, with a plumber, with an a electrician, and with a professor, all looking at the same problem together. The same way, if we look at this cross-disciplinary and across agencies, we can better harness our funds. The National Nanotechnology Initiative is an example of that. We found a few years ago that I think there was something like 19 different agencies that had some jurisdiction on nanotechnology. 12 had some funding. So we created the National Nanotechnology Initiative, which was sort of an umbrella to better coordinate that funding and to help and brought the private sector in a reorganization to not control it, but rather make recommendations of what are the breakthroughs they need. And so I think we're going to have to do more of that type of interdisciplinary, umbrella type looking at common interest across agencies and how we can get better bang for our buck.
Thank you. Let's go to the mic in the front here. Please introduce yourself and state your question.
My name is George Stone. I'm from Milwaukee Area Technical College. I have a two-part question. The first has to do with communication. As the former Congressman Gordon pointed out, many in the media, in some parts of the media, characterize science as part of a liberal conspiracy. I think among many people, they don't understand science. There's a science phobia just as there's a math phobia, and we need to do a far better job of demystifying science and explaining exactly what science is. And that this alleged war on science that's going on right now is more than that. It's really a war on knowledge, a war on rational reasoning, a war on public policy based on knowledge. And so it's really important that we get an understanding among the public out there what science is. Is there any part, so my question is there any part for Dr. Merritt, is there any part of the NSF mission which could be used, or could any part of the budget that could be used to explain to the public what science is and to demystify it and to explain it's just an attempt to gain objective truth about nature and about how things work? My second question is about basic research. Historically, many really important discoveries have been a result of basic research and have led serendipitously to very important applications. Now, basic research, you might not be able to justify it in terms of an immediate application because you don't know what that's going to be. So how do we justify, in this age of required justifications, how do we justify basic research, which is so fundamental?
All right, I think I'll try to connect both of these questions. You were asking about what NSF might be doing to try to promote a better understanding of science, the scientific method, and then this matter of investing for basic or foundational research. Yes, we have some programs, but what I'd like to come back to is something we both have been saying, and it can't be just an agency that gets concerned about the communication. It's the people, it's all of you, that how we talk about what we do, and that conversation has to be with a range of people. I've always been struck by the history of certain fields, geology, for example, that before professional geology, people were often having little clubs in which people were collecting rocks. Now, the person who was emerging as a professional geologist knew more than that, but the fact was there had to be the ability to communicate within these kinds of clubs. As things have become more professional, it's become less and less of a demand for making that kind of communication. So even if at the National Science Foundation, as we have, if we've had programs for interacting with the public, it can't just be through the programs that we support, because it's a two-way street, too. It's a matter of understanding what the kinds of issues and concerns are from that public and being able to communicate in those terms. For basic research, yes, we're very much supportive of, as I've said, we take the motto, we're where discoveries begin. And you don't always know what the consequences will be. Nonetheless, there are people, many of our citizens, who will get intrigued by the excitement that inheres in uncovering all kinds of things about the worlds we inhabit, the worlds we create. Being able to then translate and talk in those terms becomes extremely important for making the case for basic research. That why I earlier had said a lot about the connections that are made is that basic research has had, there are times you don't know where it's going, and you don't start out with something that says this has got to be the outcome. Yet we have so many examples of where those investments have made a difference. Those are the kinds of things that we have to give a lot more attention to if we're going to be able to make the case for the continued funding of basic research. My final comment there is there are people who've said, in a way, it's a luxury. It's a possibility only in countries that have a lot of resources to be able to say we can invest, where you don't have anything that you're trying to seek in the final analysis. We need to take advantage, then, of the privilege that exists and think of how we collectively work to improve the communications. Those would be my comments.
Let me dumb it down a little bit so even a former congressman can understand it. To me, science is jobs. I said earlier, we're at a fork in the road. We can compete by minimum wage or by $2 a day hours, or we can compete at a higher level. Science is going to give us the new innovation for the new types of again, services and goods, but science also is going to give the students that additional knowledge to work at that higher level. And President Obama is oftentimes, but with some he's criticized by saying, they say that he says everybody has to go to college. He doesn't say everybody has to go to college. He says everybody needs to get more education beyond your high school, whether it's a junior college, a technical school, whatever it might be. But if you're going to work at that higher level so that you're not competing at minimum wages or $2 an hour, then you have to have those skills that intersect with the innovation. So that's what science is. To me, science is jobs and a raised standard of living for our country.
Young women at the mic, please.
My name is Gretchen Goldman. I'm with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Mr. Gordon referenced a breakdown in the partnership between universities and government in terms of funding of science. And I think one of the consequences of decreased options for federal funding will be a shift from public funding to private funding of science. And I'm curious to hear from the panelists what implications they think this might have for the directions of research in terms of what questions we ask, what research questions we ask, and in terms of what research ultimately gets funded and where we go.
Well, I'll start, and then the congressman is the better person to answer the question. But actually, federal funding of research doesn't have a long history in the U.S. That before 1957, with the launch of Sputnik, that was when one saw the growth. If I take the case of the National Science Foundation, that's when the budget really grew. Before that time, the funding that occurred really was in the private sector. Corporations were funding so much more research than ever had taken place. It's quite interesting of what happened over time as federal funding continued to grow. And this doesn't mean that that corporate funding disappeared. But what came to be more and more accepted was that there were areas for investment that the government might make that would have implications for the movement of ideas into the private sector, and that then the corporations would not necessarily fund certain areas of research. So I would say I'm not all that worried about, is there going to be something that will take away the sort of independence of research. We've got a range of ways in which research is supported through the corporate sector, and it's been, again, a part of the longer history. Moreover, given the limited resources that are around, if we don't figure out a way, as the Congressman said earlier, to leverage resources far more effectively, I think it's going to be a problem for the advancements that we're talking about. But as I said, he's thought about it.
I'm more pessimistic. I think you start with a false premise, and that is that somehow the private dollars will come into the void of less federal dollars. I don't think that's going to happen. The difference between 1957 and 8 and now is, as I mentioned earlier, there's a different corporate mentality. You don't have Bell Labs. You don't have CEOs that are there for 20 years and individuals that make a career in one company. There is the excuse, I guess, now, is that they have a responsibility to their shareholders. And so that if you can't turn a profit in, there's not many CEOs that will invest beyond a 3-year horizon. Now, they may take a small amount to do a little bit of extra, but there's a change in the corporate culture. So I do not think that, I think that there is a problem if you think that somehow, again, that void will be covered. I think the other thing that's what it will lead to, you're going to see not a basic research, but rather more applied research. Because again, you get a return on your dollar quicker that way. Now, I do think I think we need to have basic research, and then I think that we need to look at areas where we need to have public dollars to help make those breakthroughs in the chain that's necessary to accomplish something. There are those really hard questions that need to be answered. But I don't think that we can concede the fact that for our standard of living to continue to go up, we're going to have federal research doing the basic research, and not only that, but the first or second level of even some of the applied research before the private sector is going to come in.
I think, though, I'm struck by the link between those comments and some you made earlier that would suggest our problem in the nation is a short-term horizon that's occurring all over the place. So, yes, corporations need to have fairly immediate returns, that you were indicating Congress people who are having to be reelected, those are short-term, and in fact, so is the pressure on for the federal funding. Yeah. That's where the question comes up. So a lot of what seems to be going on is all around, let's try to think about what's before us right now. And the question I think you were raising then is, who has that responsibility for both thinking of the immediate returns, but also ensuring that we really are healthy in the long run?
And real quickly, following up on that, I talked earlier about how there are some to the right that, again, don't want to invest in research because the general feeling is if there is something to be gained from that research, then the private sector will do it because there's a profit. Or, again, it's a liberal conspiracy. On the other side, from the left, many folks that do support research are going to say, but we have hungry children right now. We have other kinds of needs. And so those needs, those short-term important needs are also starting to squeeze out the priority for longer-term research. So we're starting to get hit from both sides.
So I'm going to turn to the results of our first question, the polling that we did, because it relates to this conversation. And if we could show the results, the question was, in your opinion, which of the following is the biggest gap in our funding of scientific research? And you can see here that long-term monitoring and data collection, 67% of our respondents think that's the biggest gap. Basic research, 20%, and new infrastructure, 30%. And what should be the split between basic research and applied research? And you can see that the majority of the audience is saying basic 50%, 50% applied, but it's kind of a nice bell curve there with the other third more on the basic side and the other third more on the applied side. So it gives you some comment or kind of perspective of those who are both here present and participating online and what their viewpoints are. I'm going to go all the way back, all the way in the back to Olivia, so we can take a question from our audience that's participating remotely with us today.
Yes, this is a question from the live chat, and I'm going to rephrase it slightly just for time. This is from Stephen Farrington asking, do you feel there's a possibility that the current unpopularity of science in public and political discourse may be rooted in more than a failure to educate the populace or in powerful anti-science economic and political interests? He asks, do you feel that perhaps initially, if science was more about expanding technological possibilities and supporting growth, that now, recognizing the limits of that growth and warning of global consequences, there's been a shift from the idea of promising advancement to science providing pessimism and demanding moderation?
Well, I didn't catch
Who
all of that.
wants to go first with that one?
But let me first, again, go to the premise. And that is, I don't think that there is by any means, an anti-science view of a majority of Americans. I think I think the really anti-science is a small vocal group that has an agenda of their own. I think then you can take another swath of it, and there's a large group of folks that don't really know what science does for them and has other priorities. And goes back again to what we had talked about earlier, is trying to make the larger public understand how this science affects them every day, their standard of living. But I don't think you can say that there is a vast anti-science view here in America.
I would pick up on the same thing, but in addition, I have some hesitation in trying to answer that question, and let me give you the reason. It's the kind of question that can be examined quite systematically. There are surveys that can be done to unravel what are the sorts of public views, what are the issues that are there, and that is really what the National Science Foundation has supported over the years in a program, Political Science. That's where this unveiling of what do we know about our populace, about the views of the populace, that's the way in which we know it can be undertaken and not just have to rely on what my view might be right now, because I don't know enough about what might be those complexities. It's a fascinating question, but it's the kind of a thing that we would suggest does warrant the kind of systematic thought that the researchers can undertake and do undertake when they've made that the realm of their own specialty. So I said I apologize for not being willing to answer the question, but I really don't have a very good answer, so thank you.
Well, that boils down to learning to speak English.
I'll go to the mic at the back of the rows of the audience, and then we'll come to the front mic, Jerry.
Thank you. I'm Bruce Gibson. I'm a county supervisor from San Luis Obispo County, California, halfway between Los Angeles and San Francisco on the coast. And I'd like to offer a counterexample, particularly to Mr. Gordon. A couple of stories from the front lines of local government. I'm an elected official. In many counties, I would be called a county commissioner. I had a constituent just within the last week tell me definitively that the bull that she, and I'm talking about a four-legged animal, the bull that was part of her herd parked in a pasture near a communications transmission tower was not fulfilling his responsibilities to the cows in the field because of the electromagnetic waves emanating from that tower, and that when she moved the bull and the cows to a different field, those responsibilities were then executed properly. And I should, I guess, have prefaced that in a former life, my graduate degrees, well, they still are, in exploration seismology. So I've been a member of AGU for over 25 years, and I'm confronted here at a local decision-making level with folks who take that as absolute gospel. And that is, you know, when we talk about the Gulf or we talk about science policy, I think within this room it's clear that we all believe that investment in education and investment in both basic and applied research is good for us as a society, good for our economic prosperity. But the gulf between what the general public how the general public approaches scientific thought and how we do is huge. That example is absolutely true and can be dealt with. But within our county, we also have the only nuclear power plant still operating in California. It sits next to an earthquake fault that's capable of a magnitude 7.5. And in the post-Fukushima world, we are pressed to try to understand whether we understand the seismic hazard to this plant adequately enough to perhaps endorse relicensing of that plant. And when we get into these more weighty conversations, we bump up against the fears that, again, the general electorate, my constituents, are deeply ingrained, and that is that we should not be doing high-energy seismic reflection surveying to understand these faults because it would, quote, sterilize the ocean. So I'm offering you these examples, but I would also be interested in your take as to how we bridge this gap between what we know is potential benefits of the scientific method and what the population as a whole perceives science to be about.
Well, it could have been UFOs that scared the bull, too.
Right.
You know, I think we've talked about the difference between the 50s and now. Part of that, I had black hair in the 50s, in contrast to now. One of the other changes over that time is that we used to have 3 TV stations that we watched, and that we had, you know, sort of we had a lot of newspapers that I think tried to get it right. Since that time, we've really gotten into niche journalism, and some of that's electronic over the internet, some of that, you know, is through tabloids, some I think the TV is tabloid in a lot of cases. And so the public seems to find their little niche in this, if you want to call it journalism, and so, you know, we would constantly get calls and letters in my office about the black helicopters, about whatever sort of the internet rumor of the day might be. And so I'm afraid that is something we have to deal with. But I think we also, in terms of we've got to sort of communicate differently. And that's part of the reason that, again, as I said, every bill that we passed to our committee was bipartisan. And let me give you an example of that. And this is a true story. You know, we all know, well, we don't know necessarily, but we read that Harry Truman was sort of a, you know, someone that said his mind. You know, he would speak whatever's on his mind. There was an occasion when there was a press conference, and someone asked him something that he didn't like, and he said, you know, that's a lot of manure. And when he did that, there was a group of ladies in Washington, this is true, went to see Mrs. Truman to tell her that that's not the appropriate way for a president to speak. It's a bad influence on the kids of America, and that she needs to stop him from saying that. And her response was, it took me 20 years to get him to say manure. And so on our committee, we didn't talk about, you know, climate change, or we didn't talk about global warming. You know, we tried to talk about how, you know, energy conservation, about the need for energy security, which people, you know, would agree upon. So I think, again, there are ways to talk about climate change and alternative energies more than just in confrontational ways. And I think we're going to have to try to do some of that.
Yeah, I would also pick up on, and use also a personal example. I was on the President's Commission on the accident at 3 Mile Island, and following that nuclear accident, there were all kinds of sessions in which there was interest shown by the general public about nuclear energy. And you know, that's the whole topic that is so polarized. But there were some people who didn't really want to, they weren't taking a position, they really wanted to know what's the best knowledge that's out there. That's what I say often, that there are other members of the public who haven't taken a position, and that becomes then a question of how to respond to, how to interpret, how to interact from the best kind of science with that community. So it's saying we still have possibilities for communication that is not going to be biased towards one particular position or another, but does represent the very best of the knowledge. That would be my recommendation for what happens. Maybe I'm saying you can't convince everybody, and that if there's very strong views that are going to be taken, they're going to be there, but there are others who certainly can be talked to. And finally, we also have the possibility of thinking about those next generations. So if there's some 90-year-old who probably is going to be convinced about what happened with the bull, but there might be others that we've got to try to think about what's the knowledge that they can develop to be able to make those independent judgments later on.
We go to the front mic. Jerry?
Yes, thanks, Chris. And thank you and AGU for creating this forum for this discussion. It's really important. I want to ask both Cora and Bart.
Can you introduce yourself to them, please?
Oh, yes.
I know you, but they might not know you. So.
I'm Jerry Miller. I'm president of a new organization called Science for Decisions, but most of you may know me from my previous job, which was Assistant Director for Ocean Sciences at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy.
And Jerry and I spent some time at the Antarctic together. We were on the Blue Ribbon Commission to review the Antarctic.
Yes, that was a lot of fun. So the question is, and this is for both Cora, since she's engaged with folks on the Hill, and Bart, since he was on the Hill for a number of years, how do we inspire senators and congressmen to devote the time and energy to think more deeply about what science does for the nation? How do we get them to have the internal conversation within their offices? We all know that senators and congressmen are exceedingly busy people. A very, very wide range of issues land in their inboxes every day. And I want to motivate this question with a particular story. I had the opportunity recently to have a long chat with Bob Inglis, former congressman from South Carolina. By all accounts, a fairly conservative Republican who, in the run-up to his last election, had a conversation with his son. The son came to him and said, "Well, Dad, I'm going to campaign for you. I'm going to go out and beat the bushes for votes, but you have to get your act together on climate change." So Bob told me that he went away, spent time, invested time in looking at that particular scientific subject, and came away with the realization that his previous position was simply wrong. So he, like most folks on Capitol Hill, is a really smart guy. He was able to see and understand the details of that issue once he invested time in it. So how do we get more friends and potential friends on Capitol Hill to invest that time thinking about the value of science to the nation?
As he's coming up with the real answer, one of them might be, I would just say, we got to go after those sons and daughters. No, it's a rather complicated matter, but I am curious in Congressman Gordon's response, because, as he was implying earlier, there are so many things that have to come onto the plate. The Congress people have to cover a number of things, and if this is regarded as a separate activity, if it's not connected in some particular ways, and connect it to things that will count for those Congress people in their districts. I'm not sure it works all that well, but as I said, those are just reflections. He's got the experience.
Well, I hate to tell the end of that story. Bob English was a good fellow. He was on the committee, and he wound up getting beaten in the next election because he did not toe that line that that climate change, is not real. Again, because that goes back to the primaries. But how do you connect with the members of Congress? As was mentioned, we're all on maybe a couple of committees and on 5 different subcommittees. Plus, we have to vote on every issue that comes to the floor. So there's lots of information. You really have to cover a lot of areas. And believe it or not, most folks are very bright and able. But you have to take it almost in cliff notes because there's so much coming at you. In addition to that, having to raise millions of dollars to run for election, and every 2 years if you are in the House. And I think, so what do you do? Well, I think there's 2 things. One, and I think part of the benefit of Rising Above the Gathering Storm was that it was a report that connected the dots. And I think that you're not going to be able to say to the, like Bob English, go out, do independent research in the wilderness, and then come back and have your results. You're really going to have respected, bipartisan, public-private type of groups that come together and connect the dots, narrow the issues as much as possible, and then ultimately connect it with jobs and connect it with, and I think that's the common denominator for all of this. It's jobs and standard of living, and I think that those dots can be connected very easily. So, in other words, don't bring me back 100 pages and tell me to read it and come to my own conclusion. It is narrow it down to, a couple of different paths, and then let me make my choice on which path to go.
I also would follow up on the notion of connecting the dots, because one of the things that we often see will be members of individual communities making the case for their own their discipline. And you've got so many coming at if every discipline there isn't the connection, there isn't the kind of, well, what are those commonalities? What is it that makes science? What is it that's science and not just what might be taking place in that particular discipline? So that's a call that we've been making at NSF for some time, asking people to connect those dots in different kinds of ways so that you really are talking about what the nation should gain from investments in the systematic work that we really see as fundamental to science.
We have time for 2 more questions. We're going to take one all the way in the back from our audience participating virtually, and then we're going to go to the last mic here for this gentleman who's been waiting so patiently to ask his question.
So this is a question from the Twitter feed asking, some have argued that it's time for scientists to take the gloves off and take an active role in elections with PACs, etc. What do you think?
I'm sorry, take the gloves off and do what?
Participate in PACs, political
elections.
activities, elections, become politically active.
Absolutely. But again, you got to tell your story in English. We got to make people understand. Got to make that connection between jobs and standard of living. And so I think that's very important. And as Dr. Merritt mentioned earlier, we really do have to go into the classrooms and make younger folks. If you think about over time, it was Smokey the Bear that made kids go home and tell their parents not to do dangerous things out in the woods that could create fires. It was the litter bug that made kids tell their parents, don't throw that out the window. It was going into the schools and making kids understand about seat belts. And it was the kids that was telling the parents to buckle up, more so than the other way around. And so I think that A part of it is, again, getting into the schools, telling the kids how science is going to impact their, again, quality of life in the future by virtue of jobs and standard of living.
Okay. I'll take the last question, and thank you for being so patient.
Thank you. I'm Mike Carrillo. I'm retired from NASA, where for more than 20 years I was a program scientist and program manager in atmospheric composition. I now work for USRA on a number of international projects for the United Nations Environment Program, World Climate Research Program, and other organizations. I'd like to continue this discussion with respect to scientific communication, and particularly that associated with climate change. Indeed, as one of our earlier questioners mentioned, there's a need for the demystification of science, but I think that only is going to play a role with the more centralist part of society, whether that society be the lay society, the scientific society, or our political society. Unfortunately, as Mr. Gordon has already mentioned, the politics has become even far more partisan in recent years than it was when you were able to get bipartisan support for more than 150 different bills. And it's been my experience and the experience of many of my colleagues that when you try to have this conversation, when you try to communicate aspects of climate change, it's far more than trying to explain the scientific basis. It's almost become a good versus evil type of confrontation. That somehow, if I believe in climate change, that my other beliefs, my values are different from yours as a person who doesn't believe in climate change. Mr. Gordon, you mentioned a desire to have the same type of standard of living for your daughter. I have those same desires for my grandchildren. And I think that if I talk to extremists on the fringes of either political party, it comes across that somehow I don't share those same desires, that my societal values, my religious values, my family values are different from theirs because I have this particular area of science that I believe in. How do we get beyond that level of good versus evil confrontation, which seems to have populated the discourse on climate change?
You know, that's really very insightful, and I think I can explain some of that. And that is, we talked earlier about how polarized the country is becoming. To some extent, Al Gore and Barack Obama are because they were out front in terms of climate change, then that is a sort of a placeholder for all those other values. It's almost like, if you agree with climate change, that must mean you agree with Barack Obama, which means that, again, all the other things that go along with that. So that's interesting about how it has, I think, become sort of that barometer for are you, we'll just say, a Democrat or Republican, are you a liberal or a conservative? The only thing I can, in campaigns, we had a saying, at least in my campaign, and that is, once you had your message, say it till you puke, and then say it some more. And it goes back, I think, it's jobs and standard of living, is how we have to cut through these things. So that's the best advice I can give you.
I think the question is a superb way to end this session because this is a conference in which those are the kinds of questions that I know you will be raising, and we will be anxious to hear from you of the conclusions that you've reached, because this is all about the policies for science and the engagement of science in the policy process. So I'm anticipating that from these extremely important discussions that you're going to have, there will be the unveiling of ideas that we simply haven't had time, or in my case, the expertise to try to address. But that's really what the conference is all about. And thus, I just want to say that I'm looking forward to the outcomes, to what you will do in connecting the dots, and what you will do to really enhance what is a theme here of preparing for our future. I look forward then to hearing more about the kinds of issues, challenges that are out there, but from a community that's prepared to address and think about those challenges. So thank you for raising the questions, but thank you even more for organizing such a conference.
Dr. Merritt, Congressman Gordon, thank you so much for being with us this morning. Your insights have certainly given us some challenges, but you've also painted some opportunities to kind of address those challenges and really reinforce and communicate the value of science. And this plenary and your insights were really, and the questions that we received, painted a really, I think, a superb context for the discussions that are going to follow. Before I go into some housekeeping items, please thank Dr. Merritt and Congressman Gordon.